Hello and welcome back. I'm Natalie MacDonald and you're joining me for today's Sydney Direct on Dukascopy TV. The Australian housing market is in its worst property bubble in history. Or is it? Well, one person I spoke to who certainly has an opinion on the matter is Louis Christopher, head of SQM Research. I caught up with him following the Australian Housing Price Index. Lee Christopher, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Always a pleasure to catch up with you.
No problem.
Okay, so we're talking in the wake of the Australian House Price Index, which came in at 1.6% versus the expected 2%. How does this fall into our housing outlook at the moment?
Okay, so today's numbers are actually fairly benign, but that was to be partially expected. The March quarter is normally a weaker quarter for house prices. That's because in part it takes into account the holiday period of January where not much is actually happening in the housing market. So the numbers, look, they've come in actually into expectations. One of the things it does show is that we do not have an out of control national housing market. The annualised rate of growth now for the Australian housing market's running at about 7% per annum.
Now, we've seen headlines today that the Australian housing market is heading for, it was described as a bloodbath collapse. Is this taking an assumption in that we're nearing the end of this price cycle then?
Well, we've got to look and see where that story actually came from. Look, we're talking about the authors one of them being a university student at this point in time. You know, look, you've got to question the track record of some of these people coming out with these claims. There's no doubt that there is an issue in terms of a lot of debt in the system. That's something that we need to be wary of. But do we actually have a national housing bubble that's about to burst? No, we don't. As mentioned, the national housing price change over the past 12 months in Australia has been 6.9%. That's not an out of control market. We do have, however, a situation where some of the country's biggest cities, particularly Sydney, is experiencing what we could now call a bubble. So Sydney at the moment on the official numbers is growing at 14% per annum, and it's been that way now since the beginning of 2013. And we believe that when the June quarter numbers actually come out, it's going to be a very, very strong result for Sydney. We think it's going to be up to about 5% just for the quarter. And yes, we do have an issue for Sydney, but it's not fair to say we've got that same issue across the country. We clearly don't.
Absolutely then. So how does APRA go about handling that then moving forwards? Obviously, it needs to put certain measures in place that can perhaps cool down sort of the Sydney issue, and as we've touched on previously, you know, a Melbourne sort of temperature as well. But we don't have that issue elsewhere. So it's all about balance, really. What can they put in place? It's
about APRA taking a tactical approach to macroprudential policy. Okay, so instead of actually asking the banks to lower their loan-to-value ratios across the board, across the country, perhaps asking the banks to focus on the Sydney housing market and investors who are buying property in that Sydney housing market. I think that's the way forward for APRA, that they take a tactical approach. That way, then a number of objectives can be met. We can keep interest rates low. We can keep the rest of the housing market in a stable mode where there's a good balance between demand and supply, which encourages construction, which is exactly what the RBA sees. And then we then control the overall housing bubble that we've got in Sydney.
What entry points then remain open to investors looking to come into this market? And also, one of the things also I wanted to ask you about was this sort of rise in off-market sales that we're also seeing.
Yes, well, the rise in off-market sales is actually really a Sydney phenomena and is definitely a manifestation of the bubble that we've got. It's a normal thing you actually see during accelerated rising markets, that properties don't even get to the listing point. They get sold before that point because there's so much demand out there, they don't really need to spend the advertising dollars. That's only the case in the minority of properties, but we think it's now getting up to about 1 in every 10 properties actually being sold before they're properly advertised.
Louis, always a pleasure to catch up with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you.
always a pleasure to catch up with Louis Christopher, and certainly we'll be speaking to him again in the near future as this story continues to develop. For now, it's goodbye from me, but we look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.